The earth had opened up, and for a widow and her children, that fissure became their last refuge. Driven out with nowhere else to go, they found themselves forced to live in a precarious shack, squeezed between the rocky walls of a canyon so narrow that the sky was merely a sliver. No one would have imagined that within that impossible home, a fortune lay hidden, capable of rewriting their destiny. The air inside the shack was heavy, thick with the scent of mold and damp earth. Daylight barely dared to penetrate the narrow canyon fissure, and the interior of the small cabin remained in perpetual twilight. Ilara's 3 children, Lyra, the eldest and most silent, Kyle, the middle and most curious, and little Maya, the youngest, clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear as Ilara tried to coax a fire from damp kindling. The crackle of wet wood was a faint sound in the silent vastness of the stone walls. The first few days were a battle against despair. Food was scarce, and the water, collected from an intermittent spring that trickled down one of the canyon walls, had a metallic taste. At night, the wind whistled through the shack's cracks, a ghostly lament that made Maya whimper and Lyra clench his fists. Ilara spent sleepless nights, listening to the distant sound of rushing water, fearing that every rain would turn the canyon into a furious river. She watched the sliver of sky above, a pale scar that barely let in the starlight. With every drop that fell, a shiver ran down her spine. Ilara knew she couldn't simply wait. This place was a prison, but it was also all they had. With fierce determination, she began to work. Using loose stones and hardened mud, she tried to seal the cracks in the walls, reinforcing the fragile foundations that barely held the shack against the cold rock. Her fingers were raw, her back ached, but the image of her children's frightened faces spurred her on. She needed to make that place safe, or at least less dangerous. One day, while trying to fit a particularly large stone into the base of an inner wall, the stone unexpectedly gave way. It wasn't a collapse, but a strange movement, as if the rock behind it were hollow. A hollow sound echoed in the small space. Curious, Ilara moved the stone aside and noticed that the rock surface behind it was different, smoother, with an almost imperceptible line running vertically. She ran her fingers along the line, feeling a small indentation. With effort, she pushed and pulled, and a section of the rock, which seemed an integral part of the wall, moved inward with a soft creak, revealing a dark, deep space. Her heart pounded. She grabbed one of the improvised torches she used to light the shack and thrust it into the opening. The flickering light revealed a small compartment, not very large, but filled to the brim. There were rolled scrolls, tied with faded ribbons, and most visibly a shimmering golden glow. Ilara reached out a trembling hand and pulled an object out. It was a heavy necklace, with stones that caught the meager light and refracted it into a rainbow of colors. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds. She didn't know the names, but she knew the value. Beneath, gold coins gleamed in disordered piles, some bearing the crests of ancient kingdoms she barely recognized from history books. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and abundant, streaming down her dirt-smudged face. They were not tears of sadness, but of shock and overwhelming hope. This shack, this desperate and despised refuge, was not just a prison. It was an ark, a hidden vault, guarding a secret that could change everything. The weight of the necklace in her hand was real, tangible, and with it, the promise of a future she had never dared to dream for her children. The dark, dangerous canyon fissure had become, by a whim of fate, the cradle of a new chance. The gleam of the jewels was a beacon in the darkness, a shimmering promise amidst despair. Ilara could barely believe her eyes, her hand still trembling as she held the heavy necklace. Her heart beat like a drum against her ribs, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence of the shack. She carefully pulled out the other objects one by one, feeling the cold weight of the gold, the smooth texture of the ancient scrolls. There were rings, bracelets, brooches encrusted with stones that seemed to capture and emit their own light. And the coins, hundreds of them, each a small wheel of sun. Her children, oblivious to the magnitude of the discovery, slept soundly in their corner, huddled together for warmth. The sound of their breathing was the only constant noise, a melody of innocence that contrasted sharply with the whirlwind of thoughts in Ilara's mind. She knew this fortune was a secret that could not be shared lightly, especially not with the little ones. The world outside, the same world that had driven them out, would covet this wealth with a ferocity she couldn't even imagine. With almost reverent care, Ilara began to examine the scrolls. The ink was faded, the writing ancient and elegant, unlike anything she had ever seen. She deciphered a few words, fragments of a story that spoke of a safe haven, of a legacy for the righteous, and of fleeing tyranny. The dates indicated centuries ago, confirming that this was an inheritance from a distant past, a treasure hidden by an ancestor who had found the same refuge in the canyon fissure. The irony was cruel and beautiful. The place of her humiliation and suffering was, in fact, the cradle of her salvation. She spent hours, perhaps the entire night, absorbing every detail, every word she could decipher. Her ancestor's story was one of resistance, of someone who had defied oppressive powers and guarded their wealth for future generations, hoping that one day it could free their descendants. That compartment was not just a hiding place, it was a testament of hope, a time capsule filled with promises. Dawn arrived, not with a glorious burst of light, but with a gradual, somber brightening of the fissure above. A solitary bird chirped high above, a faint sound that barely reached the canyon floor. Ilara, exhausted but with renewed energy, put everything back into the compartment. She pushed the rock section back into place, feeling the soft click that sealed it again. The wall looked as solid and unaltered as before, the secret safe in its stone embrace. The smell of mold and earth still lingered in the air, but for Ilara it now had a different tone. It was no longer the smell of despair, but the aroma of hope, of possibility. Her children began to stir, Maya's soft whimpers breaking the silence. Kyle opened his eyes, rubbing them with his fist. "Mother?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Is it raining?" Ilara looked at the fissure, where a few raindrops were beginning to fall, trickling down the stone walls. The sound of water hitting the rock was soft at first, but she knew it could intensify. The threat of the canyon still existed, but now she had a secret weapon against it. "No, my love," Ilara replied, her voice firmer than it had been in days. She knelt and embraced her children, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips for the first time since they had arrived. "It's not raining hard, and today will be a different day." She needed a plan. She needed to find a way to use this fortune to get them out of that place, to build a new life, a life of safety and warmth. But for now, the simple fact of knowing the treasure existed, that they were no longer at the mercy of the world's cruelty, was enough. The dark fissure, the despised home, had revealed its heart of gold, and Ilara was ready to embrace the future it promised. Ilara watched the raindrops trickle down the stone walls, the soft sound of the water, a constant reminder of the fragility of their refuge. Her embrace tightened around her children, a protective gesture that now carried the strength of a silent promise. She needed a plan, and the urgency of that place, which had once paralyzed her, now propelled her. The treasure was the key, but the lock was far away, and the path to it uncertain and dangerous. The morning advanced at a slow, damp pace. Kyle and Maya, still drowsy, asked for food. Ilara offered them what remained of the stale bread and a little water, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt the imaginary weight of the necklace in her hand, the sensation of gold and jewels, and a new determination ignited in her eyes. They could no longer live on the charity of chance, nor on the scarcity that the canyon imposed. While the little ones played with twigs on the packed earth floor, Ilara sat near the wall, pretending to observe the sliver of light. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. How to leave without raising suspicion? The canyon was a labyrinth, and the only known exit was the steep, dangerous trail that had led them there. And once outside, how to sell a treasure of that magnitude without alerting the same greedy relatives who had driven them out, or others even worse? The memory of her brother-in-law Gareth's cruelty and her sister Eleanor's coldness burned in her mind. They hadn't hesitated to steal everything they had. If they knew of the treasure's existence, there would be no peace for her and her children. Discretion was paramount, their safety the only priority. She needed something small, something that could be exchanged for essential goods without drawing too much attention. A ring, a coin. The problem was that the coins were ancient and the jewels too opulent for a penniless widow. Anyone who saw them would know they didn't belong to her. The sound of a small rockslide outside made the earth tremble softly. Ilara pressed her lips together, a shiver running down her spine. The canyon was always reminding them of its brutal force, but now she didn't shrink in fear. Instead, the threat served as a catalyst. She had to act. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to set and the sliver of light narrowed even further, Ilara made a decision. She would wait until the children were asleep. Then she would open the compartment again, not to admire the treasure, but to study it with practical eyes. She needed to identify the most discreet item, one that could be exchanged for food, warm blankets, and perhaps tools to strengthen the shack. Winter was approaching, and the cold in the stone walls was already beginning to be felt. Night fell, bringing with it a heavy silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks above and Maya's occasional whimpers in her sleep. Ilara waited patiently, observing her children's regular breathing. When she was sure they were sound asleep, she rose and, with the lamp flickering dimly, approached the wall. Her fingers traced the cold rock, finding the exact spot that revealed the secret. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the stone section slid inward. The golden glow and the shimmer of the jewels appeared again, a spectacle of wealth amidst poverty. This time, however, Ilara did not let emotion sway her. Her eyes scanned, searching for the right object. She picked up one of the gold coins, one that seemed less ancient without very evident crests. In her other hand, a small silver brooch with a single discreet blue stone. Would it be enough to buy essentials, or would it be too much? Her inexperience in dealing with money and value was as great an obstacle as the canyon itself. Ilara sighed. The first step of the plan was the hardest, getting out of the fissure, reaching the nearest village, and making the exchange without attracting attention. She would have to disguise herself, perhaps, or invent a credible story to explain the possession of something valuable. Her mind began to trace the first steps of a complex strategy, where every detail needed to be carefully considered. Freedom would not come easily, but now she had the means to fight for it. The treasure was not just wealth, it was a tool, a weapon in her battle against adversity. Ilara closed the compartment with a soft click, the gleam of gold and jewels safely hidden again. The darkness seemed less oppressive now, filled with the light of new hope and a mother's fierce determination. The next day would bring the first steps of her plan, and Ilara was ready to face them, one by one. The following morning arrived with the same damp gloom as always, but for Ilara the darkness seemed less dense. The weight of the decision, once crushing, now propelled her. She woke before her children, her body aching, but her mind sharp and full of renewed purpose. The plan, still rudimentary, weighed on her, but it was a weight she was ready to carry. She needed an excuse to leave, something that wouldn't raise suspicion in the little ones, nor in anyone who might be observing her from the fissure above, though she knew that was a remote possibility. "I'll go look for herbs and perhaps some wild berries," she would say, a task she had done before, but never venturing so far, nor with a silver brooch hidden in her clothes. After a frugal breakfast, where the last pieces of stale bread were shared, Ilara instructed Kale to look after his sisters, promising to return before the sun fully set. The boy's worried gaze hit her with the force of a punch, but she forced a reassuring smile. From the secret compartment, she took the silver brooch with the discreet blue stone. The gold coin, ancient and too flashy, remained in its bed of jewels. The brooch, with its deceptive simplicity, seemed the safest bet for a discreet exchange. She hid it in a small cloth bag, tied firmly to her waist, under her worn and dusty clothes. The climb out of the fissure was more arduous than expected. Loose stones slipped under her feet, sending small cracks echoing through the air, and the thin, cold, damp air tired her lungs with every effort. The rock walls seemed to close in on her, but Ilara did not let herself be disheartened. The sun, when she finally reached it, was a dazzling disk in the blue sky, a sight that almost blinded her after days in the constant gloom of the canyon. The wind howled through the rocks, a different sound from the whistling below, freer but equally wild, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and pine. Hours later, with burning muscles and a dry throat, Ilara reached the top. There, the landscape opened into arid hills and a faint trail that led to the village. She hesitated for an instant, her heart pounding against her ribs. The world that had rejected her was there, before her, indifferent and vast. The image of Gareth and Eleanor rose in her mind, the memory of their cruelty like a whip, reaffirming the need for discretion. She covered her head with an old faded scarf to disguise her tangled hair and pulled the fabric of her dress to hide as much of the dirt and tears as possible. She would look like a poor peasant, perhaps a widow from some distant farm, a figure common enough to pass unnoticed. The village of Eldoria was small, but bustling with life. Carts creaked over the uneven cobblestones. Lively voices mingled with the barking of dogs and the unmistakable smell of wood smoke and fresh bread. Ilara felt like a stranger, a shadow among the vibrant colors and everyday sounds. Her eyes swept the market, looking for a discreet stall, a merchant who wouldn't ask too many questions. She found an old goldsmith with tired eyes and calloused hands. Sitting behind a small stall filled with silver and copper trinkets, his demeanor was austere but not threatening. Ilara approached, her heart leaping, feeling sweat trickle down her spine. "Good morning," she said, her voice almost a whisper, hoarse from the journey and nervousness. I have something to sell." The goldsmith raised his eyes, assessing her for a moment, unhurried. "What?" Ilara took the brooch from the bag, revealing the silver and the blue stone. The goldsmith took it, turning it in the faint light filtering through the stalls. A tense silence hung between them, broken only by the distant murmur of the market. The old man frowned, his eyes fixed on the piece. "This is not common silver, nor is the stone trivial." "Where did you get this, woman?" Ilara's blood ran cold. She had underestimated the man's shrewdness. "It was my grandmother's," she lied, her voice trembling slightly, but trying to sound firm. "A family heirloom. We need food and blankets. We are struggling." The goldsmith watched her for a long moment, his eyes piercing. He seemed to ponder the story, or perhaps just her desolate appearance. He let out a slow sigh. "It's good work," he said finally, without revealing whether he believed her or not. "I can give you a few coins for it, enough for what you need." Relief flooded Ilara, so strong that her legs almost gave way. He didn't ask more questions, didn't call the guard. He gave her 3 copper coins and 1 silver, a value that to her seemed a fortune. She took the money, her hands still trembling. "Thank you," she murmured, and quickly moved away before her luck could change. With the money, Ilara bought fresh bread, cheese, some dried fruit, and a bag of grains. She also bought a thick wool blanket and a small hunting knife, essential for survival in the canyon. Each item was a victory, a step away from misery. The smell of fresh bread in her hands was the sweetest of perfumes. The journey back was equally exhausting, but the weight of the bag on her back was light compared to the burden that had been lifted from her soul. The sun was setting, painting the canyon rocks in shades of orange and purple, a silent spectacle of wild beauty. She descended the trail more carefully, her mind already thinking about how to use the new tools to strengthen the shack. Upon reaching the shack, Kyle ran to embrace her, relieved, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the earth. Maya and the infant slept, oblivious to their mother's adventure. "Mother, you're back," he exclaimed, his voice full of joy. "I'm back, my love," Ilara said, hugging him tightly, "and I brought good things." She revealed the bread and cheese, and the boy's eyes widened in admiration. That night, the family ate fresh bread for the first time in weeks. The new blanket brought a warmth and comfort they hadn't felt in a long time, and the knife would be useful for cutting firewood and preparing food. Ilara felt a deep weariness, but it was a satisfying weariness, the weariness of a battle won. She had taken the first step. The goldsmith had let her go, but the risk had been palpable. She needed to be even more careful next time. The canyon was still dangerous, but now they had a real chance to survive the winter, and perhaps to find a new home. The sliver of light above seemed a little brighter, a sign that the future, though uncertain, was no longer completely in darkness. A quiet satisfaction filled Ilara as she watched her children sleep under the new blanket. The lingering scent of fresh bread, though already consumed, hung in the damp air of the shack, a fragrance of hope. Kyle, Maya, and the infant slept soundly, their faces relaxed, oblivious to the complexity of the world outside. The hunting knife, sharp and sturdy, rested beside her, a silent promise of security. The next morning, Ilara woke with new energy. The plan was not just to survive, it was to prosper. With the knife in hand, she began to inspect the fragile walls of the shack. The sound of metal scraping against rotten wood and loose stone echoed softly in the silence of the fissure. She used the knife to cut dry branches and tough vines she found nearby, tying them to reinforce the weaker parts of the structure. The work was heavy, her muscles burned, but with each reinforcement, the shack seemed a little more solid, a little less vulnerable. Kyle watched, curious, and soon offered to help, holding the branches while his mother secured them. Little Maya, sitting on the packed earth floor, clapped her hands for each piece of wood that fit into place, her giggles filling the air. The infant, nestled in its makeshift cradle, made contented gurgles. It was an unusual scene of domesticity, framed by the dark, imposing canyon walls. As she worked, Ilara's mind buzzed. The brooch had been a success, but she couldn't risk another trip so soon, nor with something more valuable. The goldsmith, though discreet, had been shrewd. Selling more jewels or gold coins in Eldoria would be like lighting a beacon for curious eyes. She needed a bigger, bolder plan, one that would take her beyond the mountains, to a place where the story of a widow with a treasure wouldn't raise suspicions. She thought of the gold coins, the glittering jewels. They weren't just for food and blankets. They were the key to a new life. A real home, far from the shadow of Gareth and Eleanor, far from the constant threat of the fissure. But how to transform that treasure into freedom without attracting the attention of the wrong people? The idea of seeking a larger market, perhaps a more distant city, began to form in her mind. But how to get there? And who could help her? The afternoon dragged on, and the work of reinforcing the shack progressed slowly. The wind, high above, began to whistle more strongly, a melancholic sound that descended the rock walls, reminding her of the fragility of her refuge. She imagined torrential rains, sudden floods. The shack, no matter how much she reinforced it, would never be truly safe. It was a temporary home, a stepping stone. At night, exhausted, Ilara sat by the crackling fire. The flame danced, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. She took one of the gold coins from the secret compartment, feeling its cold, solid weight in her palm. It was an ancient piece, with strange symbols engraved on it. The Eldoria goldsmith would never have accepted it without asking too many questions. She needed an expert, someone who could appraise the treasure without judgment, perhaps even someone who could advise her on the best way to sell it. The idea of trusting someone, even a stranger, frightened her. Gareth and Eleanor's betrayal was still an open wound. But the solitude of the canyon was also a danger. She couldn't bear this burden alone forever. The sliver of light above darkened, and darkness swallowed the canyon. The distant sound of an owl echoed, a lament in the night. Ilara closed her hand around the coin, feeling the warmth of her own skin heating the metal. She needed more information, more knowledge. The next journey would not be to buy supplies, but to seek answers. She needed to find someone who could give her direction, a way out of that labyrinth of stone and shadow. The treasure was a blessing, but also an enigma, and Ilara was determined to unravel it. In the following days, Ilara divided her time between caring for her children and a new task, poring over the ancient documents she had found with the treasure. They were dried scrolls, some almost illegible, with complex calligraphy and symbols she barely recognized. The smell of mold and earth hung over them as she handled them with reverence, feeling history in her hands. Kyle, seeing his mother so absorbed, brought her smooth stones so she could hold the scrolls flat against the uneven floor. Amidst rudimentary maps and lists of goods, Ilara found what appeared to be a journal, its yellowed pages filled with tiny script. It took hours, but she managed to decipher a few passages. The author, a distant ancestor named Alaric, described his travels and encounters. There were mentions of the Scholars' Guild in Viridia, a large, distant city known for its scholars and antique dealers. Alaric seemed to have done business with them, entrusting them with the appraisal of rare artifacts and the discreet sale of valuable goods. The word Viridia resonated in Ilara's mind, a name that promised knowledge and anonymity, a stark contrast to small, curious Eldoria. Viridia was far beyond the mountains, a journey of several days, perhaps even a week on foot. The thought of leaving her children for so long tightened her heart. Maya and the infant were too young for the journey, and Kyle, though brave, could not face the dangers of the road. She would have to go alone. The idea was terrifying. The canyon, with all its dangers, was a known place. The world outside, with its greedy men and merciless laws, was an even greater threat. But the alternative was stagnation, life in darkness, with the constant threat of a flood or the discovery of their refuge by Gareth and Eleanor. With the decision weighing on her, Ilara began to plan. She needed more food and water for the journey, and perhaps an even better disguise. She would need something to sell only if the need was desperate, something small and of no apparent value so as not to raise suspicion. She chose a small, rough gold nugget, irregular and without the polished gleam of coins, easy to pass off as something found by chance. She carefully put Alaric's journal away, for it was her only clue, her guide. On the morning of her departure, the sun had not yet reached the sliver of light above, leaving the canyon in twilight. Ilara hugged Kyle tightly, smelling the earth and smoke in his hair. "Take care of your siblings, my love," she whispered, her voice choked. "Mother will return, and when I do, we will have a future." Kyle nodded, his eyes large and serious. "I will take care of them, Mother. Come back soon." She kissed Maya's forehead, who was sleeping, and caressed the infant's cheek. The pain of farewell was excruciating, but the vision of Viridia, a city of promises, propelled her. With her light backpack on her back and the gold nugget hidden, Ilara left the shack, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. She climbed the trail, the cold morning air kissing her face, the echo of her own breath, the only sound accompanying her. The sliver of light above was beginning to brighten, but the path ahead of Ilara was an unknown darkness, full of uncertainties and the fragile hope of a new beginning. Ilara climbed the trail, the cold morning air kissing her face, the echo of her own breath the only sound accompanying her. The sliver of light above was beginning to brighten, but the path ahead of Ilara was an unknown darkness, full of uncertainties and the fragile hope of a new beginning. The first few days of the journey were a relentless test of her endurance. The trail, which she imagined to be merely a path to civilization, proved to be a tangle of loose stones and treacherous roots. The sun beat down on her during the day, and the nights were cold and lonely, with the wind howling through the trees, a lament that seemed to echo her own anxiety. She crept through the shadows of the trees, avoiding the few travelers she encountered, her eyes always searching for any sign of danger. The small gold nugget, hidden in a secret pocket of her tunic, was a constant weight, a reminder of the risk she was taking. Food was scarce. She hunted small rodents with her hunting knife, cooking them over minimal fires that barely warmed the nights. Water was a precious resource, found in murmuring streams or puddles, collected after sudden rains that fortunately did not turn into torrents. Each step took her further from Kyle, Maya, and the infant, and the pain of separation was a constant pang in her chest. But the image of a secure future for them propelled her. She repeated the name Viridia like a mantra, a promise of a new beginning. On the third day, the landscape began to change. The trees became less dense, and the smell of distant hearth fires began to hang in the air. Ilara knew she was approaching Eldoria, the village that had once been her home, and now represented a threat. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She needed to pass through unseen, without anyone recognizing her. She pulled the hood of her tunic further down, covering her face, and tried to blend into the landscape like a furtive shadow. As she drew closer, the hum of village life reached her. The barking of dogs, the laughter of children, the clang of a blacksmith. She veered off the main path, choosing a longer, more arduous route through a hill covered with thorny bushes. From there, she could see Eldoria, a patch of rooftops and smoke in the valley below. Her stomach churned as she saw the house that had once been hers, now with dark windows looking empty and cold. A shiver ran down her spine when she spotted familiar figures near the village well. It was Eleanor, in her colorful dress, chatting animatedly with another woman. Her laughter, once so familiar, now seemed a shrill, false sound. Ilara shrank further into the bushes, feeling sweat trickle down her forehead. She remembered the betrayal, the cruelty in Eleanor and Gareth's eyes. Anger and fear mingled in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't be seen. She couldn't risk everything now. She waited until dusk, watching the village lights come on one by one, before continuing her journey. The path ahead was even more challenging. The mountains rose imposingly, their rocky slopes covered with sparse, hardy vegetation. The wind moaned through the peaks, and the air became thin and icy. Ilara felt exhaustion settle into her bones, but the sight of Eleanor and the memory of her children spurred her on. She wasn't fleeing, she was advancing. The following days blurred into a haze of muscle pain and determination. She climbed, crawled, and descended, her feet aching with every step. The gold nugget remained untouched, a last resort she hoped not to use. Alaric's journal, safely tucked away, was her only map, his ancient words an echo of guidance amidst the wild vastness. Then one morning, as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ilara reached the top of a particularly high peak. her breath caught in her throat. There, spread out in the valley below, was Viridia. It was not a village, nor a small town. It was a metropolis, a cluster of stone towers and colorful rooftops encircled by an imposing wall. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys, and the distant sound of carts and voices reached her, faint as a whisper. The city seemed a mosaic of life and promises, a stark contrast to the darkness of the canyon and the smallness of Eldoria. A wave of relief swept over Ilara, followed by a new wave of apprehension. She had arrived. The labyrinth of stone and shadow had been left behind, but the labyrinth of an unknown city and its secrets now stretched before her. The sight of Viridia, spread out like a carpet of stone and promises, was overwhelming. Ilara felt the thin air of the peaks dissipate as she descended the slope, oxygen filling her lungs with renewed urgency. The city's scent rose to her, a complex mixture of hearth smoke, exotic spices, animal odors, and the pungent smell of sewage. It was a smell of life, dense and overwhelming, very different from the clean, rocky air of the canyon. The trail transformed into a wider, well-trodden path, and soon Ilara found herself among other travelers. Carts creaked, pulled by sturdy horses, their hooves clattering on the dirt road. Men and women, some in colorful, well-kept clothes, others in simple, dusty attire like hers, moved with a purpose Ilara didn't fully understand. She pulled her hood further down, blending into the crowd, her eyes absorbing every detail. Viridia's gates were an impressive sight. Twin towers of massive stone flanked an arched opening, through which a constant stream of people passed. Guards in gleaming armor and tall spears watched the entrance, their gazes sweeping over each face. Ilara's heart pounded, a frantic drum in her chest. She remembered the last time she had tried to pass unnoticed, in Eldoria. Here, the scale was much larger, but the danger of being noticed, of arousing suspicion, seemed equally imminent. She moved with the current, trying to appear as natural as possible. A guard looked at her for an instant, and Ilara felt a shiver down her spine, but he shifted his gaze to the next traveler. She was inside. The city's interior was a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets. The din was deafening, the cry of a fruit vendor, the clang of a blacksmith in a nearby workshop, the loud laughter of children playing in an alley. She felt small and insignificant, a leaf carried by a rushing river. Stone and wooden buildings rose in stories, some with flowered balconies, others with dark, mysterious windows. Ilara needed to find the Scholars' Guild. Alaric's journal, safely tucked into her inner pocket, was her only guide. She knew that asking directly would be risky. Who was she to seek such a specific place? She walked for hours, feeling her feet ache and her head spin with the profusion of stimuli. She observed, listened, tried to decipher the city's patterns. She noticed that the most imposing and well-maintained buildings seemed to cluster in certain areas, while the noisier, more popular commerce concentrated in others. In a busy square, she spotted a city map carved in stone, but the crowd made it inaccessible for discreet study. Hunger began to gnaw at her stomach. She needed to eat, but she couldn't spend her precious gold coins. The nugget, her last resort, remained untouched. She bought a piece of dry bread from a street vendor, paying with a copper coin she had saved for smaller emergencies. The bread was hard, but it nourished her. As she ate, sitting on a stone bench in a less busy corner, Ilara saw an elderly man, in simple but clean clothes, reading a scroll. He seemed to possess the wisdom she sought. Carefully, she approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I am a traveler, and I am looking for a place of knowledge. They say Viridia has the greatest scholars." The man raised his eyes, his clear blue eyes, examining her. "You seek the Scholars' Guild, perhaps?" he asked, his voice soft and curious. A shiver of relief ran through Ilara. "Yes, sir. That is exactly it. But the city is large and I don't know where to begin." He smiled gently. "It is not a place for just anyone, my young woman. It is in the Eastern District, near the river. Look for a large grey stone building with an observation tower. It is discreet but imposing. You will recognize it by its insignia, an open book with a quill." Ilara thanked him profusely, feeling a new wave of hope. The man gave her detailed instructions, and she memorized every turn and every street. The Eastern District was quieter, with wider streets and taller buildings made of dark stone. The sound of footsteps echoed, and the city's hum seemed distant, muffled. Finally she saw it, rising majestically, a grey stone structure with narrow windows and a tower that projected into the sky. Above the massive oak door, carved in stone, was the insignia, an open book with a quill, the Scholars' Guild. Ilara stopped in front of the entrance, her heart pounding again. She had arrived. The journey had been arduous, full of dangers and solitude, but the promise of answers was now within her reach. She touched Alaric's journal in her pocket, feeling the weight of history and hope. It was time to unravel her ancestors' secrets, and with them, forge a new future for her children. With a deep breath, she pushed the door. The sound of the wood creaking echoed in the silence of the great hall ahead. The creak of the oak door echoed in the silence of the great hall, a sound that seemed too loud for the reverent atmosphere. Ilara entered the room, feeling the heavy, dusty air, impregnated with the unmistakable scent of ancient scrolls and candle wax. The hall was vast, with high ceilings supported by stone arches, and the walls were lined with shelves that rose high, filled with tomes of all sizes and colors. Flickering candles in iron candelabras cast dancing shadows on the spines of the books, creating a labyrinth of knowledge and mystery. A few scholars were scattered at dark wooden tables, their heads bowed over open scrolls, their quills softly scratching paper, the only sound breaking the almost absolute silence. No one seemed to notice Ilara's entrance, immersed in their worlds of ink and wisdom. She felt a mixture of relief and intimidation. This was a place of peace, but also of a seriousness that made her feel even more like an intruder. Her eyes swept the hall, looking for someone who could help her. In the center there was a massive wooden counter, behind which an elderly man, with a carefully trimmed white beard and spectacles perched on the tip of his nose, leafed through a colossal book. He wore a simple but impeccable tunic, and his posture exuded a quiet authority. Ilara felt he was the right person. With hesitant steps, she approached the counter, the soft sound of her boots on the stone floor seeming like thunder in her own ears. The man looked up, his spectacles slipping slightly. His eyes, a penetrating grey, assessed Ilara from head to toe, lingering on her simple clothes and the hood that still covered part of her face. "May I help you, my young woman?" His voice was calm and resonant, like a distant bell. Ilara clutched Alaric's journal in her pocket, feeling the warmth of the worn leather. "Yes, sir, I come from afar. I was informed that the Scholars' Guild possesses the greatest knowledge of this realm's history and secrets." The man smiled slightly, a glint of pride in his eyes. "This is indeed the House of Knowledge. But what brings you here? It is not common for ordinary travelers to seek our archives unless they have a very specific cause." "I do," Ilara replied, her voice a little firmer. "I have something I believe to be of great importance, a family legacy, but it is ancient, and I cannot decipher it alone. I need the help of someone who understands the languages and mysteries of the past." The scholar, whose name Ilara would soon discover to be Master Theron, tilted his head, curiosity now more evident in his gaze. "A legacy, you say? Show me." With trembling hands, Ilara took Alaric's journal from her inner pocket. The aged leather and rusted bronze clasps seemed even more fragile under the flickering candlelight. She placed it gently on the counter. Master Theron picked up the journal carefully, as if it were a sacred artifact. His wrinkled fingers traced the cover, feeling the texture of the leather. He opened the book, and his grey eyes widened slightly at the sight of the yellowed pages, filled with elegant calligraphy and strange symbols that Ilara did not understand. "Extraordinary," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "This is an ancient dialect, almost forgotten, and the symbols, they are runic, from an era long lost. Where did you obtain it, my young woman?" Ilara hesitated. She could not reveal the story of the canyon, nor the treasure. "It has been passed down through my family for generations. It has always been kept with great secrecy, with the instruction that one day, when the need was great, I should seek the Scholars' Guild." Master Theron looked up at her, a new intensity in his eyes. "A family secret, then? And you believe this book holds the key to something important?" "I am sure," Ilara affirmed, her voice choked with emotion. "My ancestor Alaric left this as a guide. I believe it hides information about a place, perhaps a refuge, and perhaps an inheritance." The scholar leafed through a few more pages, his eyes scanning the lines of text and intricate drawings. A crude map, full of markings and symbols, caught his attention. He frowned, thoughtful. "This is no ordinary text, my young woman. It will take time to decipher. The dialect is archaic, and the runic coding suggests that the author did not want his words to be easily read by just anyone. It is a task for the most dedicated of our scholars." He closed the journal with a soft thud. "Are you willing to wait, and to entrust us with this artifact for a while?" Ilara felt a knot in her throat. Handing over the journal was a risk, but there was no other option. "Yes, Master Theron, I am willing to wait as long as necessary. My family depends on it." He nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "Very well. Let me see what I can do. We have some brothers who specialize in ancient languages. But do not expect quick results. A work like this can take weeks, even months." The mention of weeks or months hit Ilara like a blow. She had little money, and her children were alone in the canyon. But the hope the journal represented was too great to abandon. "I understand, Master," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Where can I wait? Is there a safe place for a traveler like me in the city?" Master Theron thought for a moment. "There is a small inn on Quill Street, not far from here. It is simple, but clean and discreet. Tell them I sent you, Master Theron of the Guild. They will give you a fair price." He gestured to a young acolyte passing by. "Brother Elias, please take this journal to Master Kaelin's study chamber, and notify Master Kaelin about this new project." The acolyte, a serious-faced young man, took the journal with reverence and walked away. Ilara felt a pang in her chest as she watched him disappear with the only concrete link to her future. But at the same time, a sense of relief began to spread. The first step had been taken. "Thank you, Master Theron," she said, sincere gratitude in her voice. "You are welcome, my young woman. May the pursuit of knowledge bring you and your family the peace you seek." He gave a slight smile. "Return in a few days. Perhaps we will have some initial news." Ilara bowed in thanks and turned, leaving the Scholars' Guild. The oak door closed softly behind her, the sound muffled by the city's hum that awaited her. She was alone again in the streets of Viridia, but now with a clear purpose and renewed hope. The journey to unravel the journal had only just begun. The oak door closed softly behind Ilara, the sound muffled by the city's hum that awaited her. She was alone again in the streets of Viridia, but now with a clear purpose and renewed hope. The journey to unravel the journal had only just begun. The city air was colder than expected, and the sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple over the stone rooftops. Ilara pulled her hood tighter around her face, the cold wind making her shiver. Master Theron's instructions led her through winding streets, past markets that were beginning to empty, the smell of spices and ripe fruit still lingering in the air. Finally, she found Quill Street, a narrower, more discreet alley, where the light of lanterns was already beginning to glow, casting long, dancing shadows. The inn was simple, with a dark wooden facade and a small sign that swayed gently in the wind, creaking. The interior was cozy, with a crackling fireplace in the corner and the aroma of fresh bread and stew. The innkeeper, a robust woman with a kind face, welcomed her. Upon hearing Master Theron's name, her eyes lit up, and she offered Ilara a small room upstairs with a window overlooking a quiet inner courtyard. The mattress was soft, and the wool blanket was warm, a luxury Ilara hadn't felt in a long time. The days that followed were a mixture of relief and agony. Ilara tried to adapt to the city's routine, observing the people passing by, their busy, carefree lives so different from her own. She spent as little as possible, eating simple meals and saving every coin. With each sunrise, the absence of her children weighed on her heart like a stone. She imagined little Kale and the girls, Maya and Lyra, in the canyon fissure, and a sharp pang of guilt struck her. Had she made the right choice by leaving them? The hope of a better future was the only thing that kept her from rushing back. She walked to the river, watching the water flow, a constant stream that seemed to mock the slowness of time in her own life. She tried to read some of the few books she had brought with her, but her mind wandered, always returning to Alaric's journal, to the secrets it held, and to the promise of freedom. The wait was excruciating, each hour dragging like a day, each day like a week. After what seemed like an eternity, but was in fact only 5 days, Ilara could bear it no longer. Impatience consumed her. She dressed in her best clothes, which now seemed even more worn, and walked back to the Scholars' Guild. The great oak gate was closed again, and she pushed it with renewed determination. The familiar creak echoed in the hall, but this time she felt a little less like an intruder. Master Theron was again behind the counter, immersed in an ancient tome. He looked up as Ilara approached, a glint of recognition in his gaze. "Ah, my young woman, I see that patience has not yet fully embraced you," he said with an amused tone. Ilara blushed slightly. "Forgive me, Master. The wait is difficult and the uncertainty. It is heavy." "I understand perfectly," he replied, closing the book. "Fortunately, we have some news, though it is only preliminary. Master Kalen has been dedicated to your journal." He gestured to a more distant corner of the hall, where a middle-aged man, with red hair and thick spectacles, was bent over a table surrounded by piles of books and scrolls. "Master Kalen, please come here." Master Kalen stood up, wiping his hands on his tunic. His eyes, an intense brown, were shrewd and tired. He carried a scroll and Alaric's journal. "This is the journal you brought us, isn't it?" Master Kalen asked, his voice a little hoarse, as if he spent most of his time in silence. He placed the journal on the counter, opened to one of the pages with runic symbols. "It is a fascinating and incredibly complex work." Ilara felt her heart quicken. "Have you managed to decipher anything?" "Yes, some fragments," he replied, pointing to some lines. "The dialect is indeed very ancient, an archaic form of our language that was almost lost to time. And the runes, they are not merely an alphabet. They are a system of coding intertwined with the very structure of the phrase, altering the meaning of keywords. It is like a puzzle within a puzzle." He indicated a small section. "Here, for example, it speaks of the embrace of stone and the veil of water." At first I thought it was a poetic metaphor, but the adjacent runes suggest a physical location, a place where the rock closes in and water flows. It is an enigma. Ilara felt a shiver. The embrace of stone, the veil of water. She thought of the canyon fissure, the walls that almost touched, and the water that descended with every rain. It was a perfect description. Exactly, Master Kalen continued. I believe the author, Alaric, as you called him, is describing a very specific place, perhaps even a map encoded in words and symbols. But each phrase, each drawing, seems to have multiple layers of interpretation. It will take much longer to unravel the totality of its meaning. Master Theron, who had been observing in silence, nodded. Master Kalen is one of our greatest experts in archaic languages. If he says it is complex, believe it. We cannot rush this work, my young woman. A wrong interpretation could lead to disastrous conclusions. Ilara felt a pang of discouragement, but the confirmation that the journal spoke of a place and an enigma rekindled her hope. I understand, Master. I am willing to wait. What can I do to help? For now, nothing but be patient, Master Kalen said, closing the journal carefully. We need concentration and time. Return in a few weeks, perhaps. We will have more progress then. Ilara thanked the two masters, feeling a little lighter for having some news, but also overwhelmed by the prospect of more weeks of waiting. As she left the guild, the city's noise seemed less oppressive, and the light of the setting sun more welcoming. She had a clue, a confirmation. Alaric's journal was not just a hope, but a promise, and she would do whatever it took to unravel it. The journey was long, but the path, though uncertain, was beginning to reveal itself. The light of dusk painted the stone rooftops in shades of purple and gold as Ilara walked back to Quill Street. The city air seemed colder now, and a biting breeze made her pull her hood tighter around her face. Master Kalen's news was a balm to her tormented soul, a confirmation that her intuition was correct. The journal was not just a record, it was a map, an enigma. But the prospect of more weeks of waiting weighed on her like a shroud. Upon reaching the inn, the smell of stew and hearth smoke enveloped her, a welcome comfort, but one that could not dispel the anguish in her chest. She climbed to her small room, the floorboards creaking softly under her feet. The window overlooked the inner courtyard, where the sound of a fountain bubbled calmly, a contrast to the storm in her mind. The days dragged on with excruciating slowness. Ilara tried to fill the time, walking through Viridia's busy streets, observing artisans in their workshops, merchants hawking their wares, children playing in the squares. Every laugh, every casual conversation reminded her of her own children, trapped in the canyon's darkness. A sharp pang of guilt struck her whenever she imagined Kale, Maya, and Lyra alone, facing the cold and fear. Her funds dwindled daily. The simple meals at the inn were a luxury she could not sustain for much longer. One night, as she counted the few remaining coins in her leather pouch, she made a difficult decision. From the bottom of her bag, she took out a small silver brooch, one of the less valuable items from the treasure she had brought with her. It was delicate, crafted with a small, dark blue stone, but it was not something Alaric had specifically mentioned in the journal, and its absence would not be felt. The next morning, with a heavy heart, Ilara found a discreet goldsmith in a side alley. The man, with shrewd eyes, examined the brooch with a magnifying glass. He offered a fair price, enough for Ilara to stay for 2 more weeks at the inn, but the sale left a bitter taste in her mouth. It was a sacrifice, a part of their future being exchanged for a precarious present. Weeks turned into an eternity. The sound of rain hitting the inn window made her shiver, imagining torrents cascading down the canyon, threatening their shack. She tried to concentrate, reading the few books she had brought, but the words blurred, and her mind always returned to the journal, to the archaic symbols, and to the promise they held. Finally, after what seemed like centuries, but was in fact almost 3 weeks. Ilara could no longer bear the weight. Impatience drove her. She dressed in her already worn clothes and walked back to the Scholars' Guild. The great oak gate was closed again, and she pushed it, the familiar creak echoing in the hall. Master Theron was at the counter, immersed in an ancient tome. He looked up as Ilara approached, a glint of recognition in his gaze. "Ah, my young woman, I see that patience has still not fully embraced you," he said with a slight smile. Ilara felt her face flush. "Forgive me, Master. With each passing day, my children are alone. The uncertainty is a heavy burden." "I understand," he replied, closing the book. "Fortunately, Master Kalen has made remarkable progress. He is in his study chamber. Please, follow me." Master Theron led her down a silent corridor, lit by oil lamps, to a dark wooden door. Inside, Master Kalen was bent over a massive table, surrounded by piles of scrolls and open books. Alaric's journal was at the center, open. The smell of ancient ink and dust hung in the air. Master Kalen raised his head, his thick spectacles slipping slightly down his nose. His eyes, once tired, now shone with a feverish intensity. "Ah, Ilara, good that you came. I have news, and it is fascinating." He gestured to the journal. "I managed to unravel a few more layers of the code. The runes not only alter the meaning, but also indicate specific conditions. Do you remember the embrace of stone and the veil of water?" Ilara nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, Master. I thought of the canyon." "Exactly," Master Kalen continued, pointing to a section in the journal. "But it is not just a description of location. It is a condition." Alaric wrote, "Only when the embrace of stone weeps and the veil of water becomes a mirror shall the secret be revealed." And further on, "The lament of the rock shall guide the way to the hidden light." Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. The weeping of the stone, the veil of water becoming a mirror, the lament of the rock. She thought of the torrential rains that turned the canyon walls into cascades, the sound of the water echoing and lamenting. "He's talking about the rain, isn't he? About the water that descends the walls and forms puddles that reflect the sky?" Master Kalen smiled, a rare glint of satisfaction on his face. "Precisely. It is a poetic but incredibly precise description of a natural event. The secret, the treasure, seems to be accessible only under these specific conditions. Alaric not only hid his inheritance, he intertwined it with the very nature of the canyon, making it visible or accessible only when the environment transformed in a certain way. It is an ingenious form of protection." Master Theron, who had been observing in silence, nodded. He used the natural danger of the canyon as a guardian for his treasure. Ilara felt a mixture of dread and excitement. The journal was not just a map, but a guide to a ritual, a specific moment. The threat of floods, which was once a curse, now seemed to have a purpose. "So I need to wait for the rain?" she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "Not just the rain," Master Kalen corrected, "but rain of sufficient intensity for the veil of water to become a mirror. This suggests an accumulation, a calm after the storm, perhaps. The hidden light probably refers to the treasure itself, or an access point that reveals itself under these conditions." He closed the journal carefully. "There is still much to unravel, Ilara, but now we have a clearer direction." Alaric was not just a hoarder of riches. He was a strategist, a man who deeply understood the place he chose for his refuge. Ilara thanked the masters, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by a new urgency. With every raindrop that fell in Viridia, her heart leaped. She needed to return to the canyon, and she needed to do so soon. The journey was long, but the path, though uncertain, was beginning to reveal itself more clearly. The treasure was not just hidden, it was waiting for the right moment, for the weeping of the stone, for the mirror of the water. The revelation from Master Kalin echoed in Ilara's mind like a distant bell, each word a hammer forging her destiny. The treasure was not just a promise, but an enigma intrinsically linked to the very soul of the canyon. There was no more time for the patient waiting she had been asked for. With each passing minute in Viridia, her children faced darkness and cold alone, and the cost of her stay in the city dwindled her already scarce coins. Urgency propelled her with an uncontrollable force. She hurried back to the inn, her steps quick and determined. She gathered her few belongings, paid for the last night with what remained in her purse, and left before the sun even touched the stone rooftops. The journey back was a physical burden, but her mind was light, fueled by a new hope. Every mile covered brought her closer not only to her children, but to the key to their freedom. The cold wind kissed her face, and the road seemed endless, but the image of Kale, Maya, and Lyra, their pale, hopeful faces, spurred her onward. After days of exhaustive walking, her legs ached, and her clothes were stained with dust and sweat. Finally, the landscape began to transform. The hills gave way to more imposing rock formations, and the air grew fresher, laden with the damp scent of stone and earth. Ilara's heart leaped when she spotted the narrow fissure that marked the canyon's entrance. The home that had once seemed a prison now was the stage of her greatest hope. Kyle, Maya, and Lyra spotted her first, their shouts of joy echoing through the canyon walls. They ran to her, small figures of happiness and relief, and Ilara embraced them with a force that seemed to want to merge them into one. The smell of their hair, the warmth of their bodies, was a balm to her exhausted soul. She held them close, murmuring words of affection and silent promises. Their faces were thinner, their clothes more worn, but they were safe. For now. In that precarious shack, Ilara tried to explain, without revealing the more complex details, that the canyon held a secret, a gift from an ancestor waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The children's eyes widened at the mention of a secret, and a spark of adventure ignited in them, briefly replacing fear and monotony. The following days were an agony of waiting. Ilara watched the sky through the fissure above, her senses sharpened with every change in the air. The birdsong seemed more distant, the wind's murmur more melancholic. A palpable tension hung over the canyon, reflecting the anxiety that gnawed at Ilara from within. The children, sensing the change in their mother, remained quieter, their gazes often turning to the patch of sky that was their only window to the outside world. Then, one afternoon, the air grew dense and heavy. A smell of wet earth and ozone filled the fissure. A distant thunder broke the silence, a deep sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The sky, visible only as a faint grey line, darkened further. The shack door trembled with a gust of cold wind. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the rock with a dry sound and then intensifying into an incessant drumming. In a short time, the sky opened with a deafening fury. Torrents of water cascaded down the imposing canyon walls, transforming them into shimmering waterfalls. The sound of the rain was a continuous roar, a wild orchestra of nature that swallowed every other sound. The weeping of the stone had begun, a powerful lament that echoed throughout the length of the fissure. Kyle, Maya, and Lyra huddled behind Ilara, their eyes wide with awe and a little fear at the grandeur of the storm. Ilara stood at the entrance of the shack, shielding her children with her body, but her eyes were fixed on the spectacle outside. Water rapidly accumulated on the narrow canyon floor, forming turbulent streams. As the initial fury of the storm subsided a little, though the rain continued to fall incessantly, something magical happened. The water, now calmer, spread across the flat rock surfaces, creating a vast expanse of dark mirrors. They captured the diffuse, pale light that still filtered from the fissure above, reflecting the grey sky and the weeping rock walls. The veil of water had become a mirror, exactly as Alaric had described. The canyon floor transformed into an undulating surface of dark glass, and the constant roar of the water, now a deeper, more melancholic sound, was the lament of the rock, a sonic guide. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. This was the moment. She needed to act. The light was fading fast, but the conditions were perfect. She turned to her children, her face illuminated by a fierce determination they had never seen before. "Stay here, my loves," she said, her voice almost inaudible above the sound of the water. "Mama needs to do something very important, and it will change everything." She turned, and with a last look at the shack, stepped into the torrential rain and the mirror of water, following the lament of the rock. Ilara advanced, the canyon floor transformed into a mirrored river beneath her feet. The cold water rose to her ankles, then her calves, but the impetus in her heart was a fire that kept her from feeling the cold. The roar of the storm was a thick veil over the world, but Ilara focused on the lament of the rock, a sound that seemed deeper and more directed now, a guttural murmur that stood out from the incessant drumming of the rain. It was the sound of water not just falling, but being swallowed, sucked into some hidden place. Her eyes scanned the water's surface, searching for any hint of a hidden light in the mirror. The rock walls, now washed clean and dark, reflected in the undulating surface, distorted by the current. She moved cautiously, her feet feeling the uneven ground, following the sound that seemed to come from a particular section of the canyon wall, a little further from the shack. There, where the wall formed a slight natural concavity, the lament was strongest, a sound of suction and murmur that seemed to come from within the rock itself. The water there, though still moving, formed a calmer eddy, creating a clearer, less disturbed mirror. Ilara knelt, the icy water rising to her knees, and leaned over the surface. And then she saw it. Not a light from the sky, but a pale greenish shimmer in the reflection of the rocky wall, as if the water mirror was revealing something that the bare rock concealed. It was a faint, almost ghostly luminescence that seemed to emanate from a narrow, almost invisible fissure at her waist height, just above the waterline that was forming. With her heart pounding erratically, Ilara touched the spot on the rock where the light reflected. Her fingers brushed a damp, smooth surface, but she soon noticed a thin, almost imperceptible line, indicating a crack. The luminescence seemed to come from within. She pressed, pushed with all the strength that adrenaline gave her. The rock did not yield immediately, but she heard a low creak, muffled by the sound of the rain. She pushed again, this time with more desperation, feeling the urgency that this was the moment. The lament of the rock seemed to intensify, as if the stone itself was weeping and making way. With a dull thud, a segment of the rock swung inward, revealing a dark, damp passage. The air that came from within was fresh and carried a smell of ancient earth and minerals. The hidden light was now clearer, a natural luminescence that adorned the passage walls, perhaps bioluminescent moss or a rare mineral that only activated with humidity. Ilara hesitated only for an instant, the fear of the unknown battling against the promise of hope. Her children, the image of their pale faces, propelled her forward. She squeezed through the opening. The passage was narrow and dark, but soon expanded into a surprisingly vast and dry natural chamber, protected from the storm's fury. The pale luminescence illuminated the interior, revealing a spectacle that made the air escape her lungs. It was not just a compartment, but a true treasure. Piles of gold coins gleamed in dark corners, reflecting the blue-green light. Ancient wooden chests, some open, revealed glittering jewels, pearl necklaces, rings with precious stones that seemed to absorb and re-emit light, finely crafted gold tiaras. There were also rolls of scrolls tied with silk ribbons, faded maps, and metal artifacts that seemed to belong to a long-forgotten era. Alaric was not just a rich man, he was a visionary, a guardian of a fortune that defied imagination. The Lament of the Rock had guided Ilara not to a hiding place, but to a natural vault, an inheritance that surpassed all her expectations. The precarious shack, the feared canyon, the despised fissure, everything transformed into the safest and most extraordinary of refuges. Ilara reached out a trembling hand, taking a handful of gold coins that slipped softly through her fingers. The cold, heavy metal was tangible proof of her new reality. She also picked up a small gold medallion, studded with a deep blue stone, a symbol of her discovery. With her heart about to burst with joy and relief, she turned and squeezed back through the passage, the rain still falling hard outside. The medallion was clutched in her hand, the promise of a future. She emerged from the veil of water, drenched and trembling, but her face was transfigured. The diffuse light of the canyon, once somber, now seemed bathed in a glow of hope. She ran back to the shack, the sound of the rain and the lament of the rock now sounding like a song of triumph. Kyle, Maya, and Lyra huddled at the entrance, their faces anxious. When they saw her, their eyes widened. Ilara threw herself to the ground, embracing them with renewed strength. "Mama did it, my loves," she whispered, tears mixing with the rainwater on her face. "We did it. We are free." She opened her palm, revealing the gold medallion and the coins she had brought. The children's eyes widened even further, reflecting the gleam of the gold. The fear on their faces was replaced by pure admiration, a glimpse of a world they had never imagined. The shack, once a prison of stone and shadow, was now a portal to freedom. The canyon, which had isolated them from the world, became the guardian of their fortune. The irony was sweet. Justice, finally, had arrived. The family, once on the brink of ruin, was now safe, their future rewritten by the most improbable of inheritances, hidden and revealed by the very weeping of the stone and the mirror of the water.